Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining our 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence WAGEC community webinar. We are offering this webinar as a kind of way of thanking you all for being part of our WAGEC community, whether you're a donor, a fundraiser, someone who volunteers with us on a regular basis, someone who follows us on social media, maybe lives in Redfern. We just want to say a big thank you for coming tonight and for being a part of the movement to end gender-based violence. Tonight is, of course, part of 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, which is a global campaign, and Moo will talk to that a little bit later. I did want to say tonight's webinar will be recorded and later shared on our website, where you can watch it later or send to a friend or a family member to watch. And we really encourage you to keep your mute on throughout the seminar or the webinar, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. And hopefully we get a good little discussion going before we finish at 8 o'clock. Just want to remind everyone, well, first I'll acknowledge country. I would like to first pay respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose lands we're meeting on tonight. I want to also acknowledge the ongoing impact colonisation has had on First Nations communities, and that a lot of the issues we'll be talking about tonight and that have been shared over the course of 16 days disproportionately impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and children, and are a result of colonisation and the normalisation of violence. I would like to pay respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us this afternoon or this evening in this virtual room, and really acknowledge that your communities have and continue to lead the way in this work, in this prevention work, and we will continue to stand in solidarity in the fight for justice, equality, and safety for your community and all communities. Australia was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to, just welcome you all tonight and kind of go over what we'll be covering in the webinar. Tonight is an opportunity to share some key areas of our foundational primary prevention work that we do at WAGEC. You'll get a little bit of a snippet of what we do in our work, Moo and my work, with communities, with workplaces, increasingly in different spaces, such as daycare centres, which is really exciting, and I'm sure Moo will share a bit about that as well. And we'll finish up with a little bit of questions and some other ways that you can continue to be involved with WAGEC and be a part of the movement. I did also want to begin by first reiterating that we'll be speaking about quite upsetting and potentially triggering topics over the next hour and a half. And if you feel that at any point the content is becoming too much or you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, please feel free to turn off your camera or leave the webinar. If you do need to have a kind of check-in or call after, I'll share my details. But also I really encourage you to reach out to any of these numbers that are up on the screen. 1-800-RESPECT is a national domestic violence counselling hotline. It's confidential. They're experts if you feel like this maybe raised something for you, or you think that one of your friends or family members might be experiencing what we're talking about. I really encourage you to reach out to 1-800-RESPECT and just have a chat about the situation you might be going through. I'll also, at this point, like to introduce Moo, our Director of Primary Prevention. She is also the chair of the Australian's leading national prevention of violence organisation, Our Watch, which a lot of the resources we'll be speaking about tonight, we use Our Watch resources. Moo has, for over 20 years in Australia and overseas, been a leading figure in the violence prevention movement and gender equality space. She's been a part of the WAGEC community for over a decade, and I know we at WAGEC feel really lucky to learn from her and have her lead our prevention work. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Moo.
Thank you, Sasha. Can you hear me? Excellent. It's such a pleasure to be here this evening with you. Thank you for making time on a Thursday night, about the time that people are sort of thinking about dinner or putting kids to bed. We really appreciate you putting aside a little chunk of your evening and your week to learn a bit more about the work that we do here at WAGEC, particularly in the prevention space. but also where it fits in the bigger context of, as Sasha's already mentioned, the global movement to end gender-based violence. Many of you will have had interactions with WageEck already, so I'm just going to run through fairly quickly a bit of information about WageEck and what we do and how we work and where we sit within our communities. Women's and Girls Emergency Centre, it's our 45th anniversary this year. We're a feminist grassroots organisation, primarily funded by government to support women and families who are in crisis, usually as a result of domestic or family violence, homelessness, or systemic or social disadvantage. And we advocate also for social change within our communities. We're based, our main office, our headquarters is in Redfern, Sydney, and we are very, very lucky to be, and I'm very lucky tonight to be on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and paying my respects to elders past and present. Many of you would be aware that we moved last year into a new office space, which is just magnificent. And what makes it extra special is that it's owned by the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Lands Council. So one of the oldest Aboriginal organisations in Redfern. It's been around for a long time, and they've been advocating and working hard in their communities for a long, long time. So we're very lucky and privileged to be able to work and do our work here at WageEck in this space. And one of the things that makes this space really special is those of you who have visited the offices here will know that we have a really big area downstairs on the lower ground floor with a huge kitchen. And there have been many, many times over the years that come long before us where there were lots of community events, lots of yarns, lots of healing, probably a few arguments and disagreements, but I really get a sense of history and of the legacy that comes before us when I walk into this beautiful building in Redfern. And we're so very privileged to have the Metro Lands Council as our landlords. So, and we actually have staff members here Aboriginal staff members here who pretty much grew up, spent a lot of time in the building and a lot of time downstairs in the kitchen, cooking with the aunties and, you know, being part of those really important community conversations and the community organising that has gone on here for a number of decades now. So that's where we are based, and that's where I am right now. We also have a number of services and crisis responses through WageEck. So usually when you think about what a women's service does, what a service like WageEck does, you think about refuge, and we have 2 families refuges. So that's, you know, where mum and kids, usually in crisis, needing somewhere to stay in that interim period or that initial period after a crisis has occurred, before hopefully we get to move them on into transitional and longer term housing, which is where people really start to get to do their healing and recovery after experiences of violence and abuse or homelessness. And this is one of the backyards of one of our refuges, one of our families' refuges. This photo was taken a couple of years ago. We also have a single women's refuge up in Potts Point, and I think it's 15 beds up there. And we have we work with a couple of community housing providers as well. So they own the properties, but we provide support to women and families who are either living in the transitional accommodation out in the community or in a property down in Ultimo as well. And that kind of medium piece of support is really important. You know, once a crisis has passed, giving people that ability to be able to get back on their feet, contemplate what the next part of life looks like is a really important part of the journey for recovery out of experiences of violence and homelessness. So we, on any given night, we are supporting approximately 200 women and children. And usually, as I said, they're usually impacted by homelessness, and that might be related to domestic violence. It might be related to a lifetime's experiences of different types of violence. And generally that systemic disadvantage that we know that women experience. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit tonight in the context of prevention and gender equality. So the sorts of things that we actually provide are obviously case management. So, you know, that support to help people to connect with the right kind of services and responses that they need. Material aid, often people will come to us and they have nothing. So it might be, you know, clothes, bedding, things to set up a new household, practical things for kids, you know, school bags, books, devices, you know, all of the range of things that families need to be able to manage day to day. We also, our organisation is a little bit unusual. We have an amazing board, and I've already seen one of our board members has joined us this evening. We have an amazing board that is visionary, and our CEO, Helen, as well, took a big decision, a big and really strategic decision a few years ago to place equal emphasis, not just on the government-funded crisis bit, which is so important, but also the prevention piece. As one of the key organisations within our communities, we feel that we've got a really strong responsibility, not just to deal with the crisis piece and, you know, helping people rebuild their lives. And of course, that's vital and critical, and there will always be a need for that. But also to try and have influence within our communities and to start these conversations in our communities about what the prevention of violence against women, the prevention of gender-based violence looks like, and what we can do as part of our communities. And so you as WageX supporters would be pretty aware, I'm sure, of a number of the campaigns and some of the advocacy that we do on an ongoing basis. But also the donations and fundraising is a really, really important part of what allows us to be able to have conversations with community about prevention, to provide biopsychosocial support, to you know, really start to address some of the underlying drivers of gender-based violence through prevention activities like this evening, and starting to engage with a range of different private and public entities that want to be part of the global movement to end gender-based violence. You'd be aware, I'm sure, of some of the programs that we run. So we have the SEED program for children and young people. It's an incredible program that really works with children, little people, and helps them to start, you know, building their lives after, you know, they've often had been witness to quite intense experiences of violence. And so working with them, giving them the kinds of support that they need, engaging them through play, through a range of activities to be able to, you know, really start to imagine what a different future might look like. Our Access program, which is a mentoring program, and Sash will probably talk more about that at the end of, once we've talked a bit about prevention. And All In, as Sash mentioned, a really new program that we have just launched about a month ago. This is something that hasn't been done in New South Wales before. We have a small and very spectacular team of early childhood educators who are going to be going out across the state over the next 18 months, working with early childhood education centres to talk to them about what gender-based violence prevention looks like, recognising that if you start to have those conversations with children from the youngest ages, and you start to break down gender stereotypes before they're really formed for little people, then potentially within a generation we will see much less community support for violence supportive attitudes, for example. If we equip little children all the way through the education system and through a range of different ways that we can interact with children and young people, whether that's, you know, schools and universities and TAFEs, whether it's places that they work and play, We hope that in a generation's time, things are going to look really different, and social expectations and community attitudes will be really, really different. And that's where we will see that prevention piece really coming in to its own over the next generation or so. And of course, the other piece that we have within WAGEC is in-house psychological services, which is something that, again, doesn't exist generally in a service like ours. And it's really through the generosity of donors and, you know, quite visionary people who see the value of this work, who allow us and facilitate us to be able to do, to offer people a really well-rounded, beautiful set of responses within WAGEC services. So that's a bit about WAGEC. This is the visual WAGEC journey. This is obviously a visual depiction of a client's journey through our services. So any of you who have interacted with us before a little bit will have seen this, I'm sure. We really love sharing it with people. And it's a great way of explaining how people can move through the system in a really positive way, which is the top half of the frame, and what some of the consequences are where people are not able to access support and the right kind of support that meets their needs. So if you see on the left-hand side of this, this woman might engage with a service due to domestic or family violence, could be physical, sexual, economic, spiritual, emotional violence, a whole range of different types of coercive control. And where she's able to engage with a service like WAGEC, then we would immediately offer crisis support, and we'd have a conversation with her to work out what that is that she needs. So she might engage with our rapid response worker at the front door, or through the or by phone if she's staying in temporary accommodation and has been referred through to WAGEC by police often, or domestic violence line, or she might come straight into our crisis accommodation, or both. She may get both of those responses depending on her needs and the capacity of the system as well. Once she and her family are safe in accommodation, and you know, just thinking about remembering that that critical time when people choose to leave an abusive relationship can be the most dangerous time. So it's really essential that she and her family have supports wrapped around her very quickly. So once she's in safe accommodation, it's then our job to try and find safe housing for her. And as you would be aware, and as most people in Sydney are aware, the housing part is often the most difficult challenge, particularly for our case managers who are working with women and families who may have no income or really limited income. She may not have been allowed to have a job and earn money. She may not have been allowed to study. She may have just been told that she's stupid and worthless, and therefore doesn't have that level of confidence to be able to think about what it's like to, you know, to rent a place, live somewhere with her, live somewhere with her family. So it's really starting to kind of build in those practical pieces. So, you know, finding the accommodation, finding something that is affordable, but also really starting to build in some of those supports to help her get to the point where she feels confident and comfortable to be able to be self-sustaining in some way. Having a roof over your head, however, doesn't guarantee you know, a nice pathway to recovery if you don't have money or means of financial independence, or if you're struggling with your mental health, for example. So, and often we know that women come to us and they might be on a temporary visa. They may have real challenges with accessing things like Centrelink, Medicare. They may have Australian-born children, but you know, be on a temporary or a student visa here. And so wherever possible, we're working with that woman to give her the tools so that she's able to live sustainably and won't circle back through the system. At the top of this graphic, you can see a little bit about some of the programs that I mentioned earlier. So the SEED, our access program, and our SEED parenting program. These are the sorts of things that we put into place once people are no longer in crisis. So there's an initial kind of set and wraparound responses when somebody's coming immediately from violence or homelessness. There's some things that need to be stabilised. But then one of the things that is most rewarding and really different and a bit unique about WAGEC is the pathways that we walk alongside her on to economic security, healing the trauma through those biopsychosocial responses, and giving her the confidence to be able to build the life that she wants, with her children where that's relevant. The bottom part of the journey, I'm not going to talk to too much, but this really just talks to the sorts of barriers and blocks that people experience. And often we see people really sadly who cycle through the system in and out. Sometimes they'll come to us for a little bit and then something will happen in their lives, and unfortunately they'll come back again. We are always happy, and our door is always welcoming and open for women who have engaged with us before. There are no conditions on coming and seeking support from WAGEC. We think it's really important that people always feel welcome here, and that they know that no matter what's happened, they will get a smile and a cup of tea, and somebody who can share a little bit about what their options might be. So thanks, Sash. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence is. It's a United Nations United Nations-led campaign. I think if you are connected to social media, you would have to be living under a rock at the moment to not be blasted by many images and stories relating to 16 Days of Activism. 25th of November, last Friday, is the beginning of the 16 days, and that's, of course, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And it's something that now is celebrated and commemorated, and gives rise to a whole range of different conversations and events in many different organisations across the world. I have been out and about over the last couple of weeks doing all sorts of events, having conversations with people in such a diverse range of settings, and it's all about 16 days. So very encouraging that this is something that's recognised, broadly across a whole range of corporate and business settings, as well as, of course, schools, workplaces. A whole range of people really start to have those quite critical conversations over this period of 16 days. And of course, 10th of December is International Human Rights Day. That's the last day of the 16 days. But there are a ton of activities that occur over this period of time. I've been very privileged just to be down in Canberra yesterday for the press club address by Kate Jenkins, the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, and that was just an incredible gathering of people from all over the country who had flown in to hear and talk and have some of those really critical conversations about sexual harassment, because of course we know sexual harassment is a huge issue in Australia. It's something that employers now are starting to take very seriously. And we've had legislation passed in Parliament, in the federal Parliament this week, that really puts a lot of emphasis on the responsibility of employers of all shapes and sizes to start to take really concrete action within their workplaces to ensure that sexual harassment is reported, is dealt with properly, and that there's a strong preventative approach to that as well. So a very important couple of weeks for us. But basically the headline of 16 days is it's all about the prevention and elimination of violence against women and girls. And I'd really encourage you to, as well as obviously participating tonight, to have a look out for other activities that are in in your settings of, community, workplaces, elsewhere, because it's such a powerful time, and the conversations that we're having these days now over 16 days are very, very sophisticated. So always happy to talk more about 16 days. Thanks, Sash. We're going to watch a video now, and I'm going to have a sip of water. Do you want to hit play, Sash? This is one of our videos, one of our animations that we created and launched last year. We made these videos really to try to find a simple way of explaining some of the concepts that we talk about a lot at WageEc, and they're very much designed to be shared, to spark conversations. Please check them all out on our website. We'll probably play one or two of them this evening, but really just kind of breaking down and demystifying some of the basic concepts around things like what is gender-based violence. Thanks, Sash.
Women's and Girls Emergency Centre acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respect to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. This was, is and always will be Aboriginal land. What is gender-based violence? Gender-based violence is any act of abuse committed against somebody because of their gender. The United Nations define it as physical, sexual or psychological harm. Threats, stalking, cyber abuse, emotional, verbal, financial, cultural and reproductive coercion are all gender-based violence. It includes physical and non-physical acts that intimidate or create fear. Sometimes it's a one-off incident, for others it's a pattern of abuse over a long period of time. The context where abuse happens means that we use terms like domestic or family violence, intimate partner violence, lateral violence, domestic abuse, sexual assault or workplace harassment. Gender-based violence is a product of the patriarchy, a system that benefits and prioritises men and doesn't give women the same opportunities. It shapes our family structures, systems of government, business, law and communities. It limits freedom and choice. Gender-based violence, gender inequality and victim blaming can make it really hard for victim survivors to seek the support and the resources they need. At Women's and Girls Emergency Centre, we support women and children in crisis. We also partner with communities, private and public sector entities to challenge gender inequality with the aim of ending gender-based violence in a generation. If you or someone you know needs support in Australia, call 1-800.
Thanks, Sash. If you haven't seen that video before, I do hope that you enjoyed it and that it sparked a couple of thoughts in your head. If you have seen it before, we are always really keen for feedback on the materials that we create and resources. We'd love to know whether it's something that resonates with you and whether it's something that you have shared and used in some of those critical conversations that we need to have within our community settings. This beautiful tree is a creation of Sash. And Sasha created this really fundamentally to try and break down some of the misconceptions around what violence is and what it looks like and where it happens and how it is all interconnected. So you can see in this graphic the social context or the root causes of gender-based violence, things like the patriarchy, transphobia and cisnormativity, ableism, colonialism, ageism, for example, and of course class discrimination, which is one that we don't talk about a whole heap about in Australia. The second level of the tree, some of the definitions, so some of the places that relate to the context where that violence takes place. And so things like workplace violence, structural violence, sexual harassment, lateral violence, intimate partner violence. We use a lot of these words or phrases interchangeably, particularly in New South Wales. We talk a lot about domestic and family violence, and what we're actually thinking about much of the time is intimate partner violence. But these are all different types and different manifestations of gender-based violence. And then the fruits of the tree. So these are some of the activities or the ways in which this violence manifests. So things like sexual violence, legal violence. So thinking about, the family court as a place where It often perpetrates or perpetuates violence and abuse that has occurred within a relationship through that really structured system. When we think about all of these types of gender-based violence, our mind usually goes to things like physical violence or sexual assault or sexual violence. But what we know is that it's often a series of different types of behaviour that are really designed to intimidate somebody, to keep them walking on eggshells, second-guessing themselves, their ability to make decisions, really undermining their confidence and their ability to make choices and decisions about their daily life. So things like stalking, financial violence, or economic abuse, where you're limiting somebody's ability to be able to be independent and make choices about their life. Reproductive violence and abuse. So that might be, making somebody, stopping somebody from having access to their reproductive rights, to abortion, to even having a conversation with a GP, for example. Or it might be forcing somebody from to take medicine, or really just coercing somebody around their reproductive choices. Emotional violence, and sometimes we think about this as psychological violence as well. And that's that piece of really wearing down somebody's sense of self, making them doubt themselves, gaslighting, we talk about a lot. And that sits kind of neatly hand in hand with things like spiritual and cultural violence, where if you're stopping somebody from worshipping their religion, if you are disconnecting them from their community or the people around them that support them, if you are preventing somebody from being in touch with friends and family, those things around us that make us feel nice and safe, and keep us within our zone of being able to make decisions day to day. All of those different types of abuse that you can see, the fruits of the tree, are really designed often in a quite thoughtful and systematic way to wear somebody's sense of self down and their ability to make decisions. And we know, of course, that those roots at the bottom really significantly contribute to the normalization of violence. So we live in a society that still says that in some circumstances it's okay for men to have more power than women, and what we know is that is a really the key driver of violence. And as we saw in the video just previously, the patriarchy is embedded throughout our structures and our systems. It's in our workplaces, it's within our government and our systems of organisation of society. It's deeply embedded in our literature and our history and the way that we see ourselves as Australians. And so that patriarchal construction of the world really normalizes gender inequality, which then allows violence supportive attitudes, and allows us to blame victims or to excuse violence when we see it. It was because he'd had too much alcohol, or it was because he was really stressed at work, or it was because she had an affair. That's why. We know that whilst Australian attitudes, community attitudes to violence against women have changed pretty significantly over the last decade and a half or so, those sorts of attitudes are still really quite widely held, particularly among young people. So there's a lot of work still to be done if we're really going to start to challenge some of those root causes, and then the attitudes and behaviours that allow them to continue to thrive. Thanks, Sash. We've got another really quick video for you here, talking about the impacts, and then we'll go into a bit more detail.
Women's and Girls Emergency Centre acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respect to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. This was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. What are the impacts of gender-based violence? On average, every 9 days in Australia, a woman is murdered by her current or former partner. Since the age of 15, 1 in 5 women have experienced sexual violence, 1 in 3 physical violence, and 1 in 4 physical or sexual violence from an intimate partner. These statistics are similar globally. The UN estimates that 35% of women worldwide have experienced gender-based violence. In Australia, First Nations women, women with disability, women from culturally diverse backgrounds, and LGBTQ+ people experience it at even higher rates. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. Many more are impacted by non-physical coercive control, a pattern of intimidation, violence, humiliation, threats, and manipulative behaviour that isolate and leave a person living in fear. The ripple effects mean children, families, and communities may be impacted too. Each person's experience is different, and abuse may happen in more than one relationship. Somebody might be experiencing coercive control from an intimate partner, be financially abused by their sibling, and also experience racism or transphobia in the street. Impacts of violence and pathways to recovery are personal, but anyone who experiences abuse should be able to access the support they want. At WAGEC, we support women and children so that they can choose the best options for recovery. Even though women and their children are the ones that are most affected, by normalising gender equality in public and private life, everyone will benefit. We all have a responsibility to be a part of ending gender-based violence in a generation. If you or someone you know...
So that's just starting to introduce the idea that normalising gender equality, giving value to all, equal value to all genders. If we live in a society where that is the commonly held attitude and belief about genders, then women will be less likely to experience violence, and we will be less likely to tolerate it as a society. But we've talked a little bit about the high-level impacts here. Certainly, we know on average every 9 days a woman is murdered by her partner or former partner in Australia. These statistics have stayed, the homicide statistics have stayed fairly stable in Australia, despite quite significant investment in a whole range of different responses, including crisis responses, including improving the way that police respond to domestic violence or intimate partner violence. We know now, we can track much better now the journeys that women have and the interactions that women have with parts of the system. And that might be, services, frontline services, it might be police, it might be courts and legal systems. And sometimes, she hasn't had a conversation with anybody, she hasn't interacted with anybody before she tragically loses her life. But we know much, much more now about women who die as a result of domestic violence, homicide in Australia. And it's really only in the last probably 6 or 7 years in Australia that has been something that makes headlines. When I started working in this space 20 plus years ago, it didn't even make a couple of column inches in the newspaper. And where it was reported, it was something that was reported as a tragic, often a murder-suicide or a tragic story, but there was no connection made to the fact that this was a problem that was impacting on 60, 70, 80 women a year, and many children as well. So one of the things that has changed quite significantly over the last couple of decades is media have got much better at understanding what domestic violence and intimate partner violence looks like. And have got much better at reporting on it. And that's part of that cultural and social change that we're talking about. The media is, incredibly powerful and has the ability to really tell the nuances of these stories and to start to break down some of that victim blaming that we talked about previously. So that's a really important thing that we have, come some way to improving in Australia. We know, of course, the United Nations tells us and have told us consistently over a long period of time that at least 35% of women across the globe have experienced gender-based violence. For many of those women, they will experience a number of different types of gender-based violence throughout their lifetime. So they might experience child sexual assault. They then may have, a series of unhealthy relationships. They may, experience violence and harassment in the workplace as well. They may experience street-based harassment and be experiencing abuse within their family context too. So the statistics here in Australia correlate fairly well with that international average, but we also know that in some countries the rates of violence are significantly higher, and we're probably talking 90% of women and girls experiencing some type of gender-based violence in some countries. And the personal safety study, which is where these statistics come from in the bottom, this is a huge piece of research that's done. It's a phone-based piece of research done by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And we know from that, and it's a fairly longitudinal piece of research as well, we know from that since the age of 15, 1 in 5 women, 1 in 5 Australian women have experienced sexual violence, 1 in 3 physical violence, and 1 in 4 have experienced physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner. So those statistics are pretty shocking, but also they don't tell the whole story. They're numbers. They give us some sense of the scale of the problem, but they certainly don't tell us the nuance of the story and those individual impacts on women and children, and then the ripple effects on the people surrounding them as well. Thanks, Sash. And of course, we know that not everybody experiences this violence equally and is impacted equally. Domestic and family violence, gender-based violence doesn't discriminate. It exists in every single postcode, in every community across Australia, and in every generation. This is not something that just touches some socio-demographics. It may look a little bit different for within some communities or some community settings, but it exists absolutely everywhere. And we know also, of course, that men can be impacted by abuse within the intimate partner context. But what the research tells us and what the personal safety study tells us is that they are far less likely to be fearful of their female partner. Where that's the circumstances in which they're experiencing that abuse. They're far less likely to be concerned about their physical safety. So it's usually experiences of emotional and psychological abuse. And they're more likely to have options. And this is one of the things that makes it really hard for people to make that decision to leave an abusive relationship. It's often a lack of resources and a lack of ability to access finances to recover post an abusive relationship. In some fairly new analysis of the personal safety study data, the last slice of personal safety study data, in 2016, they estimated that 23% of women and 16% of men had been emotionally abused by a current or former partner since the age of 15. And the rate was highest for women who were both physically and sexually abused as a child. So we know where children have had experiences of violence and abuse, whether or not they've directly witnessed that, if they've been living in a household where abuse is occurring, we know that certainly that can be an indicator that they may have experiences, or they may be more likely to have experiences of violence and abuse in an adult relationship with a partner or a former partner. I won't run through all of these statistics, but I think the one that probably we need to be most aware of and most cognizant of, trying to change is the rates of violence around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and girls. We know certainly that they experience violence at more than 3 times the rate of non-Indigenous women. We know they're 34 times more likely to be hospitalised. as a result of domestic violence and non-Aboriginal women. And we know often that the supports that should be there. So, you know, the usual places that people would go to, police, for example, and support services aren't always, you know, the safest places as well. And that's certainly something that we are continually working on at WageEc. It can be really, really hard if you are from a multicultural or culturally and linguistically diverse community, if you're LGBTIQ, if you are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, to walk through the front door of a service like WageEc and not know what kind of judgment you might have around what's happened in your life and what's happened in your relationship. So we really try to be, you know, not just welcoming to everybody, but make it very, very clear to the people in our communities that we are a place that you can come in and have a non-judgmental conversation. And if we're not the right place for you, then we will try and find that right place for you. And that can be really tough. You know, it can be really, really tough to get through the front door, whether it's, you know, virtually through a phone call or through finding us online, or actually physically walking through the door as well. So structural inequality and discrimination are intersecting with gender inequality to impact on groups, you know, right across our communities. And certainly Australian women and girls with disabilities have extreme rates of violence and often really, really struggle to get the support that they need within a whole range of different service settings. Thank you, Sash. So the impacts on the individual, the experience for every person is very, very different, and therefore people will be impacted differently. Sometimes that's because of people's access to resources and supports, and you know, things like housing and employment, the ability to actually be able to either stay where you're living or stay where you're working can have a really huge impact in terms of your well-being post violence and abuse. Of course, economic security and education are really key parts of that as well. But we know, of course, it impacts on a mum's relationships with her children, and of course relationships with family and friends, those really key support people around you that keep you going when times are tough. And often those relationships will have been really systematically broken down by the person who's doing harm, you know, to really try and isolate and stop somebody from being connected in with family and friends and support people. And of course, we know, you know, the health, the physical and mental health impacts include things like trauma, complex trauma, can often result in things like disability and acquired brain injuries, and of course just deep sadness and grief, and for many people that will be, you know, a really hard and anxious time in those first few weeks and months after you've experienced violence. Many of the impacts on the individual are unseen. So women will often say, yes, he, you know, physically hurt me, but actually it was the psychological harm that really damaged me and really was the hardest piece to recover from. And so that there's that piece that we really try to work on in terms of building people's confidence, removing the shame and that fear of being judged, which is one of the biggest barriers to seeking support in the first place, and then being able to reconnect with, you know, friends, family, work colleagues, for example. Was that a question or a comment? Or maybe just somebody coming off mute? Next slide, please, Sash. Thank you. I'm going to run through the cycle of violence really quickly. Some of you may or may not have seen this before. This is a thing that we use a lot when we're talking to WageEc clients and people in our prevention training as well. And it's often a thing, if you are supporting somebody in an informal way as a, you know, a friend or an ally, sometimes running through the cycle of violence with them is a way of actually, it can be a light bulb moment. So The cycle of violence is it's a pretty simple concept. It basically explains how a person doing harm, how their behavior will change in a cyclical kind of way, and of course how that impacts on the person that is being harmed. So moving up through the top, through the build-up phase into standover, and that's when there will often be lots of threats and behavior that is really physically and emotionally threatening, through that acute explosion phase, and that's often when you will have that crisis and police might get called and there may be physical injuries, moving very quickly into that remorse phase. So as I said, once you've had that acute explosion, that will be the time when somebody may make that decision, that's it, I've had enough, I want to get out. And if somebody who is using harm and violence in their relationship senses that, then they will very quickly try to re-establish the power and control. That might be where there are the apologies and the promises that it won't happen again. And often that'll be accompanied by a pursuit phase where, somebody may have left or maybe temporarily staying elsewhere, and it'll be lots of text messages and it might be gifts. It might be threats. Often that will move in then to the honeymoon phase, where everything is just really lovely again and pretty chilled. And that phase is the bit that can be really tough, where you're supporting somebody and you've seen them go through this cycle a few times, and you can kind of spot that they're in the honeymoon phase, because what inevitably is it's going to build up and move around the cycle again. And the cycle of violence is something that might happen over a few days. For some people, it happens in over a few hours, but usually a few days or a few weeks. For some people, it may even be long periods of time in between those phases. So if you're a friend or a family member who is noticing some of those red flags, some of the sorts of behaviours that you think might be moving, might be abusive and moving them through those phases, and then you finally work up the courage to have the conversation and say, I'm worried about you, I'm concerned. They may then turn around, because they might be in the honeymoon phase by that point, and talk to you about the fact that everything's lovely and he's apologized and it's much better and he promises it won't happen again, and he was just having a really tough time in this situation. So it can be hard to have that conversation when you are observing these sorts of phases of behavior, and that's why cycle of violence is a really useful thing to be able to understand why people stay in violent and abusive relationships as well. Thanks, Sash. So we might move on to the next one. I don't want to share this video because I'm a bit short on time. This is a graphic illustration that really tries to explain primary prevention. So obviously you can see at the top of the triangle, we've got WAGEC there. That's where people come to us and they've experienced that crisis, and they need some sort of response. So it could be WAGEC, it could be the police, it could be a range of different things that are needed in that kind of immediate post-crisis phase. Early intervention in the middle of the triangle is things that really occur where you're able to notice that people might be at higher risk of experiencing or using violence. So remember we talked earlier about children who've grown up in really abusive households, then may go on and have abusive relationships as adults as well. What we might do is we might think about what a school program looks like for young people. So talking about healthy relationships, for example, and talking about respect, starting to build in some of those tools for those people to be able to prevent them from entering another abusive relationship later on. It might be things like drug and alcohol support for parents, and some of the interventions that we see within medical settings, so things like routine screening for domestic violence, which happens in a number of different settings in New South Wales Health. All of these are ways of kind of starting to think about how we can change that path for people who might be at more risk. And then primary prevention is the beautiful slice at the bottom. This is the piece which is about whole of population, and it's all about addressing those underlying drivers of violence that we looked at when we were looking at the tree there. So it's things like campaigns, the Stop It at the Start campaign, for example, which is the big national campaign run by the government. It's community trainings and forums to start to build literacy and understanding about the link between gender inequality and gender-based violence. And some of those activities that really start to challenge violence supportive attitudes and behaviours. It's really thinking about the social context and what needs to change so that violence stops before it actually starts. And community are a really critical part of the social change piece. What this triangle aims to illustrate is the connection between gender inequality and violence against women, and how if we prevent violence at a whole of community at that bottom level, we can stop women and families moving up to the pointy end of the triangle. So that's prevention in a nutshell. So where and how can we start thinking about preventing gender-based violence? Change the Story, which Sasha talked about at the beginning, is one of the key documents that we have in Australia that talks to how we can do prevention on the ground in a whole range of different settings. I'd really encourage you to have a look at it if you haven't seen it. It's quite a unique document in that we have some structures and systems in Australia that have been set up over the last 10 years or so under the first national plan to reduce violence against women and their children, which just ended earlier this year. And one of those structures is Our Watch, the organisation that I am very privileged to be the chair of. And Our Watch has produced a number of different, frameworks and guides, I guess, and sets of resources around what prevention really looks like. And so Change the Story tells us that we can, if we start to have these conversations with children and young people, particularly within the education system and within a range of different education settings, if we're having these conversations at an individual level with our families and those relationships in the home, within the community, if we start to look at what workplace equality and respect looks like in a whole range of different types of business and employment settings. And then obviously the critical piece is through our institutions and governing bodies. So some of the big conversations that we've started to have in the last couple of years about things like Parliament House and what respect for women and all genders looks like in Parliament House are really, really critical parts of this long-term shift that we're undertaking in Australia at the moment. And it won't be an overnight thing. We're not going to shift those 35% statistics that we saw back there a few slides ago overnight, but we are starting to see some positive indicators that things are starting to change. So why are community interventions meaningful and powerful? Well, I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer. If somebody is being impacted by harm and they are, really isolated and it's at the hands of somebody that they're intimately connected with, or if they're experiencing, street-based harassment or violence, and it could be, a stranger on a train stalking a woman or a non-binary person, making them feel really unsafe in that setting, then they're really likely to be fearful, and they are very unlikely to feel as if they can take action, and they'll feel very disconnected from others. So when we think about that in the intimate partner space, we start to talk about things like the concept of being an ally. So it might be a partner or an ex-partner or a family member who is doing harm to that person. And we know evidence tells us really, really strongly, both within family and community settings and within workplaces, it's peers, it's people who sit alongside us, who are often the first responders and the first people that we talk to when we're having those experiences. And so community-based interventions are really powerful because they act to break down that shame that we talked about. So, you know, when you're experiencing some kind of violence or abuse or intimidation, you are likely to have quite complex feelings of shame and possibly some guilt, and possibly some, you know, self-blaming thoughts. And sometimes actually you just love that person and you want the violence to stop. You want that abusive behavior to stop, but you love the person, the core of the person that you're with. So that can be really complex and difficult to start to unpack some of those manifestations of shame and try to work out whether that relationship is good for you or not. The other important thing about community-based interventions, the things that all of us can do, those actions that we can take as, you know, bystanders and allies and support people, is creating that connection. So you can be a lifeline to somebody who is feeling utterly alone and trapped. And it's simple stuff. It's not complex, complicated, you know, detailed kind of case management approaches. It's telling somebody that you're there for them, asking if they're okay. You know, we've got much better in Australia at talking about mental health and asking people close to us if they're all right, if they're okay. It's a similar kind of conversation with people that you, people around you you suspect might be experiencing violence or abuse. You know, just opening that connection and really nurturing it in a way that is not just offering practical support. It might be simple things like, you know, do you have enough money? Do you have somewhere to stay tonight? Is it better if you crash at mine this weekend? But also that real patience. So being there for the long haul if necessary, being generous of spirit and non-judgmental. And that can be really hard when you're supporting somebody that you care about deeply. It's not always an easy thing, but my suggestion would be keep it really simple. Ask things like, are you okay? How are things going? I've been thinking about the last time that we talked about this, and it's always good to sort of name the behaviours rather than, you know, use words like, I think your partner is abusive and what are we going to do about that? You know, I've been thinking about the last time we talked, how are things going now? When we're intervening as an ally or a bystander, we're really asking those questions with the intent of listening actively and creating connection, not making a judgment or trying to problem solve. And that moves us on beautifully to our 6 R's. This is, again, a really useful tool just to kind of keep in mind when you're thinking about potentially stepping into a situation. These are some tips on what to do if you are worried about somebody that you know. It could be, again, it could be a friend, a family member, a work colleague. So the first R is recognize. So recognizing some of those red flags. And if you want to know more about red flags, hop on the website. We've got an animation all about healthy relationships and red flags, and it talks to some of the sorts of behaviours that you might see or witness in an unhealthy relationship. So just being aware of what some of those types of behaviours might look like from the outside. Excuse me. Responding, so making sure that you're responding really empathetically and gently, asking, listening where appropriate, maybe in a workplace setting, asking somebody if it's okay just to take some notes, documenting it. Sometimes that can be a really powerful ally action that you can take to support somebody. You know, they may not feel comfortable being the person that documents the abuse that's occurring. Might be taking photos of injuries, for example, or it might be taking screenshots of you know, a litany of text messages that are coming through that are abusive. Really, some of those kind of simple practical actions that indicate that you are there to support and that you're there to stand beside and walk alongside that person. Fundamentally reassuring them. It's so important that if you're supporting somebody, that they know that violence is not their fault. And often, as I said, they will have complex guilt and confusion around the actions that person is taking. Sometimes it will be very clear, and they'll be very clear that what's happening is not okay. But often it will be connected up with a whole range of different conflicting feelings as well, particularly if that person still, loves their partner or ex-partner. So really reassuring them that what they're experiencing is not their fault. Respecting the decision that they make, and this can be a really, really tough one. If you're a friend or a support person for somebody who's experiencing intimate partner abuse, for example, they may make a decision which is completely at odds with what you would do in those circumstances. But you have to respect that not only are they the best person to be able to make the decision about what's right for them, but also in respecting their decision, you're allowing them to regain that sense of control over their life. They may have had everything else decided for them for a really long period of time. So giving them that power back to be able to start making decisions and mistakes as well, where it's, where that's what they want to do. Also recognizing that if somebody talks to you about a bit of what's going on in their life, in their relationship, they may just be having that conversation with you and just kind of testing out the waters a little bit to get a sense of, what's going on and whether you're a safe person to talk to. They will be usually managing really complex risk and safety within their domestic setting. So they might be managing not only the impacts of their partner's behaviour, but also managing things like safety around their kids and safety around themselves as well. So recognising that you may feel that what the next step is for that person, but actually respecting their decisions and their choices. Referring somebody, so making sure that you're just aware of like the key support services that are available, whether that's WageEck or 1-800-RESPECT or some other kind of support service. And then recovering, making sure that you take care of yourself. If you are supporting somebody, particularly in the long term, it can be really tough and it can weigh you down. So making sure that you've got the right kind of supports around you to ensure that you don't feel either triggered or sad or angry or helpless. That's the 6 R's. So just a range of different services that are around here, around the WageEck kind of sphere, and I won't run through them all individually one by one, but I think this is a great graphic that always shows me how privileged we are to be able to work in partnership with a number of these different organisations. Most of these are inner west based or in a city or inner west based. And it doesn't mean that every woman who needs it will get the help that she needs, unfortunately, because there's a whole range of complex factors that interact across our systems and structures of society, the stuff we've talked about already that often prevent women from getting that support. But we are very, very privileged in this part of the country to be able to know that these are this is just a range of the supports that are available to us both as support people and the people that we're supporting too. And I think this is the point at which I hand over to you, Sash.
Yes, I'll just quickly talk about ways you can stay involved before we can open up to questions and finish. But I'm sure a lot of you know about these different opportunities. You'll be all on our mailing list, and that's probably how you got involved with this webinar. But just to go through them really quickly, our Access program is currently recruiting for mentors. So if you are interested in learning a little bit more about what we've talked about today, and interested in supporting a woman through her next kind of stage towards financial independence, whether that's through education or getting a job, or even if it's just about building confidence with her, we really encourage you to apply to be a mentor. It's a 6-month program where basically you personalize that relationship. You can either meet once a week or once a fortnight, once a month. It really depends on what you set out in your goals in the first kind of establishing meeting. It's a really great program. It leads to, we've had so many women build confidence, get jobs. They get enrolled with TAFE or uni. And it's just a really nice opportunity to kind of build a relationship and give back. We find that a lot of the mentors also have massive learnings at the end of the program as well. So it's kind of that mutual benefit relationship. And opening, you can become a mentor now. So if you are interested in applying, hop onto our website and apply. Fundraising, donations collective, and volunteering are part of our kind of fundraising and communities offerings. If you would love to fundraise, I'm not going to explain what fundraising is, but we are always appreciative of funds and people raising awareness as well. Our donations collective, you can sign up to a mailing list where we send out a monthly update of our material donation needs, and that's just kind of a group of people who really want to go out and get that list. We find that so helpful, and it really stocks up our donations cupboard for women who are in Redfern or in our sites and need material aid and support that way. Volunteering, there's a bunch of different jobs around. You can do, like I said, a mentor, or you can do more of that kind of practical work in our refuges with our children and young people. You can offer pro bono services in a whole range of things from marketing, legal work, really whatever your specialty is, we'll take it. And we're always so appreciative of volunteers. And then prevention, which is what we're doing tonight. If you are from a workplace and you think that your workplace would benefit from training, we really encourage you to get in touch. We're always building our prevention work. We also run community trainings, so keep an eye out for trainings. We'll probably be running the next one in May, and then several other trainings throughout the year. Just also, prevention is about spreading the word. So taking what you've learned tonight and having a conversation with a friend or a family member and showing them about WAGEC and explaining what primary prevention is and what Moo's spoken about tonight. I think that's probably where the power will come, in those daily connections with our people. I might open it up to questions